Well, hello, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Biz Gallo, and I am the Statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator for the Library of Michigan. You're joining us today for our webinar, How to Pick Your Web Presence, Creating and Sharing Digital Collections. Now, we laid the foundation for creating digital collections in last year's 9-part Digitization Basics webinar series, which you can view on the Library of Michigan's YouTube channel. But we've been diving a little bit deeper this year with our How to Pick series, where we're getting into a little bit more advanced topics. So far this year, we have covered format-specific classes like digitizing newspapers and audiovisual material, resource-centered classes such as working with vendors, working with volunteers, and building community archives, as well as procedural classes like writing digitization grant applications and creating digital exhibits, which is why I'm so thrilled today to be joined by Richard Adler, who is the coordinator for the Michigan Service Hub of the DPLA, and he's going to speak to you about sharing your digital collections online. So welcome, Rick.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining me today. Um, the positioning, I want to try to position this presentation a little bit. My presentation is less about you building a particular web presence on your own website. I kind of presume that your institution has already done that. What I'm really talking about is sort of where you could potentially go from there. And I'm going to talk about the project that I'm involved in and how that could present one option for you to take those exhibits that you have online and expand the reach of them to a broader audience. There we go.
Great, thanks. Before we dive in, I wanted to go over just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to view it again later. For those of you who are here today, Becky will send out a copy of the recording right afterwards, but it will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week or so, allowing time for captioning. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and Rick said he'd be fine answering questions throughout. So if it's something really relevant to what he's talking about, feel free to drop that in, raise your hand. If you experience any technical issues, please feel free to reach out to either me or Becky in the chat. We can help you resolve those. And then there are also many additional resources about digitization and digital collections on the Library of Michigan's digitization webpage. Other than that, I will hand it over to Rick. Thank you.
Thank you. So, sort of building on what I said before, what I'm going to be talking about today has a lot to do with two websites. The Digital Public Library of America, they have a website, and then Michigan Memories, which is a website that came out of the work that I've been doing as part of this project called the Michigan Service Hub. And Michigan Memories is there as more of a Michigan-centric kind of version of what the DPLA is trying to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how both those websites came to be, what they're trying to achieve, and also where they're going to be going in the future. Now, it's possible that you may have been hearing news about the DPLA in the last couple of months. Just want to let you know that I'm going to get into some of that at the very end, kind of give you a capsule summary of where the DPLA is and where it's going. So my hope is that if you have any questions about that, that I'll be able to resolve them. And obviously, if you have any additional questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that as well. We're kind of in an interesting position here in late June because we've got a new version of Michigan Memories on the way. It's not quite ready yet. And the DPLA is in the middle of this big 10-year process, and they're not quite done with that yet either. So I'll try to fill you in as best I can, given the knowledge that we have on both those things at the particular moment. But short version, I'm feeling optimistic about both things. Okay, so before I really dive in, or let's say take off, since I've got airplanes here, one question I wanted to, a couple of questions I wanted to kind of put in your mind as I present this whole talk is to ask yourself, think about your institution, and ask yourself which of your collections best reflect the mission and focus of your institution. Now, I'm not necessarily just talking about collections that have been digitized and put online already. There may be collections that you'd like to do that with, but you just haven't had the time or resources in order to get there yet. But just kind of take a moment to kind of think about your institution, think about your various collections, and think about the collections that really define what your institution is about, what it's trying to do. Because those are the sorts of collections that when I tend to have my first conversations with people working in different places, those are the collections that tend to be the ones that I talk about first. And in fact, if you're feeling in a more promotion kind of framework, if you want to put some of the name your institution and some of those collections in chat, that would be great. I always like learning about new collections. And in fact, if you've already worked with the DPLA and you've already worked with me and you actually have some of your collections that you're sharing with DPLA, feel free to mention those too. We're just trying to think about what are some of the essential collections that our institutions are working with. Now, the second question I have there, are those collections currently available on your website? That's not a gotcha. That's just simply, again, trying to get you to think about where your collections are in terms of access and sharing online. As we all know, sharing collections requires a lot of time and money and technical support, and none of us have too much of any of those things. And so there are plenty of good reasons why a collection that you'd like to have online isn't there yet. But again, just trying to get us thinking about essential collections and their presence online as I begin to talk about the work that I've been doing, what the DPLA is, and what Michigan Memories is. Okay, so let's take ourselves back to 2013. We were in an interesting situation that was a great opportunity and also a bit of a problem. It was an opportunity because we had, oh, here we go. Actually have one. Papa Library currently working through a huge collection for the Graves family. Okay, founding partner. There we go. Founding pioneers. Excellent. Exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about. Something that would have a wide interest to anybody in Michigan and also interest to anyone involved in the pioneer experience in America. So a good example of the sort of collection that we would be thinking about. And this kind of ties in with what I'm about to talk about in this slide too. The fact that we have a variety of different institutions, libraries, archives, museums, historical societies, all of us having different collections that have a very broad range of interest. But the question is, how do we get the general public or specific parts of the general public to know about those collections? We're all on these separate websites. So in a sense, we're asking people to know that our institutions exist. If you live on the other side of the state, you may not be aware what may be up there in the UP, or if you're in the UP, you may not know necessarily what all the institutions are in southeastern Michigan. So there's a communications issue here that Access is trying to solve. But with all of these interesting collections distributed on different websites, it does pose a problem for somebody who's trying to research a particular topic. Are they going to have to go one by one through each website separately? Or are they going to take their chances with one of the commercial search engines, which, as we've seen in the last couple of years, are only becoming less trustworthy as they go along? Your collections might be exactly what they're looking for, but they might be buried in a set of search results that are from a variety of different sources, many of them not terribly trustworthy, and almost certainly not very well documented. So this was the problem that everybody could recognize in the early 2010s. And it's the problem that the DPLA tried to solve and has been trying to solve for the last 10 years. The idea for the DPLA emerged out of a series of symposia that happened in sort of like the broader Harvard community back in the early 2010s. And it led to the launch of the Digital Public Library of America in April 2013. So the idea of the DPLA was, let's try to replicate the user experience of a commercial search engine, but when people search for a given topic, all the results they get will be from curated collections from museums, archives, only from cultural heritage institutions. And in that sense, they can have more a sense of trust in the results that they're getting, and hopefully a higher quality in terms of what those search results are going to be. Oh, and I should actually mention right now, the American DPLA is only talking about the institutions that are included in it. It's not a limitation on the subject matter. You can find collections about anything under the sun, the full range of human experience, as its former director once said. So it's DPLA of American institutions, but it could be any topic at all that you can think of. There was actually an inspiration for the DPLA in an earlier project that's still going called the Europeana Project, which takes the same kind of approach for Europe and the European Union as the DPLA does in the US. And in fact, they share a lot of the same workflows, and they actually even share some of the same code behind the scenes. So the Europeana project kind of got there first, and then the DPLA drew some inspiration from that. And if you don't know about Europeana, I highly recommend it. They also have exhibits and a lot of the interesting records that the DPLA does. And I'm going to come back to, thank you for sharing this in chat. I'm going to come back to this at the end so we can talk about some of these collections that you're sharing. Really appreciate that. Okay, so the DPLA has been around for 10 years. Just a couple of months ago, they crossed a huge milestone in getting to 50 million records aggregated. I'm going to talk about records in just a minute, what that actually means. But this represents an enormous amount of work that has been going on for the last 10 years. And it's a real milestone for the DPLA and a real accomplishment that has added just this incredible richness in terms of the materials that you can find in the DPLA and all the kinds of things that have been searched. And in fact, of that 50 million, we're actually sharing over 1 million records just from Michigan. So there's a lot of scope just state by state as well as in the aggregate. The DPLA website includes online exhibitions, and they also have, I'm not going to talk about their ebook programs today, but they do have ebook initiatives going on as well. So they're really trying to cover the whole experience of being a library online. Now, the important point to make about this, and gets into the Michigan Service Hub and what is the Michigan Service Hub and how does that fit in? The DPLA is a small group. It's a nonprofit. For many years, it worked out of a small office in the Boston Public Library, but now it's sort of their members are distributed all across the eastern U.S. There are hundreds of cultural institutions throughout the United States, and the DPLA staff has never been more than about 15 people, and usually less than that. And so it simply wouldn't have been possible for such a small staff to be able to work one-on-one with all the different cultural institutions across the U.S. that would have collections that would properly belong in the DPLA. And so when the DPLA launched in April 2013, they also launched something that they called the Hub Network. Now, the Hub Network includes two categories of different institutions. And the purpose of the Hub Network was to expand the reach of the actual DPLA staff across the US to create some kind of a structure that would have the scope to allow the DPLA to effectively work with everyone, with all the different institutions all together. So as I say, there are two kinds of hubs. You got the content hubs and you got service hubs. Content hubs are big institutions. Some of these are continuing to act as content hubs. Some of these were content hubs for a while, but contributed what they wanted to contribute and are not playing quite as active a role today. But just looking at this list here, you can see the scope of the incredible collections that are included in that 50 million records aggregated with the DPLA. One of them, HathiTrust, is here in Michigan, but these are scattered all over the US. And obviously, just these collections alone, brought together into one search box, is a pretty impressive collection. And it covers just a wide range of all the different collections that these different institutions have to offer. But I'm working for the Michigan Service Hub. The service hubs are covering everyone else other than those large institutions. Most of the service hubs are state by state. So we have the Michigan Service Hub. And the service hubs work as sort of go-betweens. So rather than work directly with their own collections, the service hubs act as go-betweens between the DPLA staff on one side and all the other cultural institutions within a given state on the other side. And so by distributing the work, the service hubs in each state are able to do the work of the one-on-one relationships with all the different institutions, collect all the records that those institutions want to share with the DPLA, and then make them available in sort of like one point for the DPLA to ingest into their systems. We haven't quite got to all the different states in the union having service hubs, and some of them cheat a little bit. There's some doubling up going on. Colorado, Wyoming, New Jersey, Delaware. Not all the hubs are not all the service hubs are single states. Some of them are double states, and some of them are actually a couple more than that. But we pretty much have the map covered, and some other service hubs are still in development even as we speak. And so it really does sort of cover the whole scope, even if it doesn't actually fill in all the blanks of every state in the union. But today we're really working on the Michigan Service Hub, so let's primarily focus on that. So I mentioned that the DPLA started in 2013. The Michigan Service Hub started in 2015 as a result of a memorandum of understanding that was signed between the Library of Michigan, the Midwest Collaborative for Library Services, the University of Michigan, Wayne State University, Western Michigan University, and Michigan State. So these institutions came together in 2015 and they said, the DPLA is an interesting project. We'd like Michigan to be a part of it. And so they came together and agreed to collaborate on the creation of a coordinator position, which is the position I take, but also to provide the services that the coordinator would need in order to prepare collections in Michigan for sharing with the DPLA, and also to do outreach to all the different institutions that might have collections that they would want to share. So I was hired in 2016, and then I've been working on various initiatives with the Michigan Service Hub ever since. So let me make 3 points here just to kind of clarify what's going on. The Michigan Service Hub is an independent project. It's not actually part of the DPLA, so I'm not actually a DPLA employee. I work with the DPLA a lot, but the Michigan Service Hub was created in Michigan, and it has its own agenda and it has its own priorities. So it's not tied necessarily to the DPLA, and certainly not tied in any kind of administrative way. The second thing is, and this is something I'm going to keep coming back to, is when I'm talking about sharing collections, the only thing that DPLA works with, and the only thing that the Michigan Service Hub work with, are the metadata that each institution uses to describe each collection it wants to share. So when I say we're sharing collections, we're not actually sharing the digital objects of those collections. We're only sharing the metadata that describes those collections. And that opens up some interesting advantages and opportunities, which I will be talking about in the rest of the presentation. Alongside that, the DPLA from the very beginning has always been a strong advocate for the idea that metadata should be in the public domain, that these are tools for discovery, and we want to make those as available for use and for reuse as possible. And so the DPLA has always had this position, and we've adopted that here in the Michigan Service Hub as well. So if you're thinking that really essential collection at my institution, it includes copyrighted materials, that's fine. That doesn't get in the way of sharing with us, because all you would be sharing would be the metadata describing those collections. So like I say, I'll be coming back to that point and explaining how that works as I keep going on with this presentation. Okay. I've mentioned Michigan Memories, the website. You may be familiar with the older version of the site that we launched in 2018. That really got us going. It really helped us sort of establish what the Michigan Service Hub was in alongside the DPLA. But there were certain things about the original version of the site that never quite worked the way we wanted it to. And so thanks to funding provided from the Library of Michigan, we've been able to do a complete rebuild of the site. Uh, as Biz knows, we've been really, really close to being ready to launch it, but as with any web development project, it takes longer than you expect. And so we're in sort of like the last stages of trying to get everything working, and then we're going to launch the new version of the site. Like the original version of the site, it's going to have a DPLA style experience where you can search for various topics. But whereas the DPLA has aggregated collections from across the entire US, we're focusing just on the collections that we have here in Michigan, making those available. But we're also going to have finally something we've always wanted to have from the beginning, which is the ability to build exhibits and educational tools around those primary sources in order to help to highlight some of those more interesting topics. We've got a million records here in Michigan. We have to provide a way for people to get a better understanding of what those collections are, and also to build curricular tools that will allow teachers to use these materials in classrooms more effectively. And on Michigan Memories, we can make sure that those curricular tools match Michigan's social studies standards. And so we're really making an effort to try to give teachers what they actually need here in Michigan in order to use those tools most effectively. We're also hoping to save teachers time because they don't have time to search through a million records for the resources they use. So we want to try to make it as easy for them to get access to these materials as we possibly can. We've also given it a whole fresh new look. And if I have some time at the end, I'll give you sort of like a little bit of a glimpse of what the demo is. Although I'm hoping I can come back here when the site actually launches and give you a more formal introduction when everything is finally up and running. So I mentioned that what we're doing with the DPLA and with Michigan Memories, by the way, is sharing metadata, not the actual collections themselves. So let me try to give you a sense of the advantages of handling it that way. If you go to Michigan Memories and you do a search for, let's say, a very Michigan topic like Fago, you're going to get a series of search results. And this is an example of the kind of page that you would see. And the results of that search, so you type in, let me go back a bit, you type in Fago into that search portal, you get a page like this showing a set of results. Each one of these results is a record that's been shared with us from a different institution. So in this case, the Wayne State University Libraries, Detroit Historical Societies, they have shared the collections that these records were a part of, and they've also provided us with metadata that describe those records. And it's the metadata that you see here presented in the search results. So if you share a collection with us, it's your metadata that we're going to be using, so you have complete control over how that record is going to be described. We also, whenever possible, try to provide a thumbnail image of what the record is, whether it's a photograph or a letter or a diary, whatever it may be, so that it becomes just a little bit more enticing, encourages people to click on that particular record. So let's say that our patron here, searching for Fago, is interested in one of these records and wants to see the full record of it. If they click on the title link there, they'll get a page that looks like this. So what this page does is it takes all the metadata that we have shared, not just the particular fields we show on a results page, everything that has been shared with us about this particular record from the institution that has custody from it, all of it's presented here, along with that thumbnail image again. So again, you have a lot of control over the context that your records are being placed in when you share it with the DPLA or with Michigan Memories. But we do only show a thumbnail. We're not actually showing the full actual record itself. We've gone as far as we can on our site with the metadata, but the actual record itself, we don't go quite that far. And the reason is, here's the advantage. If the patron wants to look at the actual image itself, they can click on that blue button underneath the image, View Item Record. And at that point, when they click on that link, they will actually leave Michigan Memories and go to the site, the actual website of the institution that shared that collection. So this is a win-win situation. By sharing with us, you will have your collections included in either a nationwide search at DPLA or a Michigan-wide search in Michigan Memories. But to the extent that the patron who's doing that search becomes interested in your collections, you will get the benefit of added web traffic for your website, you know, and they'll actually be in your website. And at that point, you're in complete control. You have complete ability to establish the context for all of your records, for how they're described. They can get access through your website to the rest of a collection that it may be a part of. It's really a win-win across the board for everybody. This also means, incidentally, that it actually doesn't matter. One question I often get is, what kinds of files are you able to share? Because we're only sharing metadata that describe records, we can basically share a record no matter what format it takes. If you have IIIF support, if you had some kind of a 3D representation or something, we may not necessarily support that technology on Michigan Memories, but we don't have to. We're pointing to your website. And so we can literally point to anything that you have on your website, any form of a record it might be. So you don't have to do any changes to your records. You just have to provide us with the metadata to describe each of those records, and we can just take it from there. Okay. So the DPLA has had exhibits from day one. They are not creating exhibits quite as often now as they used to, but they have quite a trove of collections on their websites now that cover a wide range of topics. The advantage of these collections being that they can draw from institutions across the entire US. So the quality of those collections is quite high, and they put a lot of time into them in order to cover the various topics that they did. We have always wanted to do this here in Michigan. As I said, the first Michigan Memories didn't quite allow us to do that in the way that we hoped, but the new one will. And so we're going to have a page of educational resources and a page of exhibits. And we're in the process now of building those out. And we hope that when you share collections with us, that you would be willing to also allow us to make use of them in these exhibits or these curricular materials in order to, take full advantage of them. And again, this is another way that we can expand the scope and the web presence of your collections. So this is still to come. We're in the process of working on it, but we have a lot of plans for the future, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have about that aspect of Michigan Memories as well. Couple side things I just want to mention kind of quickly, but this can be kind of helpful for understanding what we're doing here. I'm talking about moving a lot of metadata around, and those of you who are catalogers or work with metadata know that that can be a very challenging process. Um, Back when the DPLA first got started back in 2013, they were using an application called Repox. And Repox would allow you to ingest metadata from one institution and send it on to another institution. It was a fairly straightforward way of sort of sharing metadata from one museum or archive or library and getting it to the DPLA. It worked okay, but it was a bit of a black box. When you brought metadata into it and then send it out again, there was no way to actually look at that metadata, validate it, examine it, correct it while it was in Repox. So when we were working with our very first sharings with the DPLA, we didn't know whether the metadata we had would represent well until it was actually live on the DPLA website, which was not great. So back in 2018, actually back in 2017, Wayne State University got a grant to build a better tool for managing our metadata. And they ended up creating this application we'll call Combine. Combine did everything that Repox did, but it also came with a suite of analytical tools that allows us to examine the metadata and make sure that what we've got is what we really want to be sharing with the DPLA and also what we want to put up on Michigan Memories. This has been a real success, and in fact, several other service hubs around the country now also use Combine in place of Repox. So it was a real contribution that Michigan was able to make to the entire DPLA community. We've got Combine to a working 1.0 version. My dream is that we may eventually be able to get back into some sort of a grant-funded effort to try to add to it. But for the purposes of today, the reason I'm talking about Combine is to give you an idea. If you're wondering, like, well, how does all this happen, this work that you're talking about, it's kind of like a bird's eye view here of what we do. So on the left-hand side, we have all these different cultural institutions, libraries, archives, museums, all throughout the state. And when they have an initial meeting with us and say, okay, we'd like to share some collections, and we'd like to share these particular collections, we'd like to make the metadata for those collections available. What I do then is put them in touch with a metadata specialist at one of the other three universities. And metadata specialists at those universities work with a chosen liaison at that institution to talk about which collections do we want to share and what's the metadata we want to use to describe those collections. Now, here's an important point. We're not going to ask you to make any changes to your metadata. Whatever metadata you use that makes sense for you, we want you to continue to use that. But what we want to do is map it over to the MODS metadata schema that we use in the Mission Service Hub and that we share with the DPLA. So that second column there is where all that magic happens. Michigan State actually continues to use Repox, but we have combined versions of Combine at the other two universities. And when the metadata has been prepared for the given collections, I then pull all of it into the Combine I have here at U of M, and that gives the DPLA a one point of contact. They can, what they call, harvest all the metadata from the U of M version of Combine, and then it can appear on the DPLA. And this is also how we're going to get collections shared through Michigan Memories as well. I hope that makes sense. I can talk about it more if you have any questions about it, but I'm just trying to give you a broad sense of the workflow of how we get metadata from your institution to the DPLA and Michigan Memories. The other question I get all the time is, how can I get started with this? And as I said, we're not going to ask you to change anything you do. We're going to work with you with what you have in terms of metadata and map that over to what we can use and what the DPLA can use. But there are some questions we like you to think about up front. This kind of goes back to those first couple of questions I asked at the beginning, to think about your collections in certain ways and about, because these will help determine which collections would be appropriate for sharing with the DPLA. So the first thing we ask is, are your digital collections on your website publicly accessible? And by that we mean we want to replicate sort of the Google experience as much as we can. Well, the remaining good parts of the Google experience, whatever they are. Basically, what we're saying is we don't want people to run into like a login page or any kind of a paywall or anything like that. This is generally tends not to be a problem with, our institutions, but it's worth making a point that as much as possible, we want, well, not as much as possible. We really want people to be able to click on one of those links I was showing you before and go directly to a given record. Ideally, we want to have a thumbnail image for every record. It makes it that much more enticing, makes it a little bit more likely that people will click on your record, take a look at it. And of course, as I said, when they do that, they're going to be coming to your website and adding to your web traffic. So thumbnail images are our friends. Um, and then we have these last three questions, and this gets into a little bit more about metadata best practices. And we're not going to require these as such, but we really strongly encourage you to think about collections that can meet these particular criteria. So the first is metadata fields. How do you use metadata fields? Are you using them consistently? If somebody goes and takes a look at a creator field, are they going to find the same type of value in the first collection, the first record of a collection, as in the last one? You want to be consistent in terms of how you use your metadata fields. It just helps people with the findability of your collection. The other really important point, and this can be a deal breaker, is do you have the right to share your collections online? And obviously, this is a question you want to make sure that you can say yes to, even if you're not working with us. You want to make sure that everything that you have up online, you have the rights in order to justify to be able to share it. And then the last one is the one that can sometimes, I don't run into this as often as I was afraid I was going to when I first started with this job, but it does happen ever so often. Can your metadata be understood in a nationwide context? So my usual example for this is, do you have a photograph that refers to Main Street, but doesn't refer to which city in Main Street, what city that Main Street is in, or even what state that Main Street is in? You want to make sure that your metadata don't assume local knowledge. You want to make sure that somebody who's searching your records on DPL and the DPLA from maybe many states away will look at your record in your collection and be able to understand exactly what they're looking at and where in the world it actually is. So those are just good best practices for metadata anyway, but it's something that we do like to talk to institutions about when we first start talking about sharing collections. In terms of what we do actually require, again, this is what we're sort of mapping over to our profile. But what we're really looking for in your collections, very, very simple. We want each record to have a title. We need to have some kind of a right statement. The data provider is the name of your institution. And then we need to have a direct link to each record. And then, as I said, a thumbnail image of it. Actually, the thumbnail image is not actually required. We can put a generic image in place of the thumbnail. But as I've been saying, having a unique thumbnail is going to make that record much more enticing to a user and that much more likely that they're going to want to take a look at it. And as for the rest of these fields, we recommend them, and it would be better if your metadata includes good, solid information and metadata in each of these other fields, because that's going to increase the findability of your records and make them more likely to pop up in a wide variety of different searches on either the DPLA or Michigan Memories. So we don't require them, but we do recommend them. And we hope that if you do work with us over a period of time, that we can be an encouragement or even an excuse. If you want to improve your metadata, you can say, well, among the other benefits of improving our metadata, our records that we're sharing with the DPLA Michigan Memories will be easier to find. So we love being an excuse for people to get funding or grants in order to improve their records. If you want to know more, we have a spreadsheet that we share. I can provide the link for that, or if you want to contact me, I'll have my email at the end here. Happy to share this. It goes into a little bit more detail about why we ask for the fields we do and how we prioritize them. And then I have other information I can share if you're ready to learn more about the process. Okay, a couple final things. As I mentioned, we're a big believer in the idea that metadata should be in the public domain. You're probably familiar with Creative Commons licensing. If not, or if you haven't looked at it in a while, I certainly recommend take a look at the Creative Commons and see where they are and get a refresh. Their public domain designation has actually changed a little bit. It still basically gets the job done, but it's an evolving project and it's something to keep up with. But if you've also worked with CC0 or with Creative Commons licensing as part of an institution, you have probably realized that CC0 licensing or CC licensing is really great for individuals, but it isn't quite what institutions are often looking for when it comes to trying to provide guidance for their patrons in terms of how they can use their materials. And so the DPLA has been a big supporter of another project called rightstatements.org, which has been around for several years now and was created. It's not a DPLA project, but it was the DPLA was one of the institutions that the rightstatements.org project was meant to benefit. The idea behind the rightstatements.org project was to create right statements that institutions could use precisely in order to provide the guidance that they needed to for patrons. It's meant to be sort of like a support or a complement to CC0 licenses. So if you've been struggling with right statements and trying to find the right legal language to use, rightstatements.org is what you want to go to. Go to it right away because it could probably save you a lot of time and energy because they really are meant to try to be a big time saver for institutions and help them with this issue of finding good right statements for their online materials. So if this is something new to you, I highly recommend to take a look at it. It's a very good site with good explanations. And that takes me to where we are right now. So as I mentioned, I was hired in 2016. I've been working as the Michigan Service Hub Coordinator for quite some time. But right from the very beginning, I would often get questions from institutions that wanted to work with us about digitization and about digital preservation. And I really didn't have good answers for them because my focus was really on access, and we really needed to have the other two legs of what would become the three-legged stool. And I'm very happy to say that uh, the State Library and the Midwest Collaborative Library Services actually took my job description and crafted two new positions that became the positions that my colleagues, Biz Gallo and Chelsea Denault, now hold today. Biz was hired on as our first digitization coordinator, and she has provided, as you know, all this information about grants and best practices about digitization. And Chelsea, of course, has now been working with the Michigan Digital Preservation Network to make sure that all the work that we're putting into creating these online collections is safely preserved for the future. The three of us now work very closely together, and we actually tend to meet with institutions as a team so that when those questions about digitization, digital preservation come in, we're all there together and we can actually address the questions people have from the full spectrum of working with digital records. And so this has been a huge benefit to me and a great benefit to them that we're able to work together. And so when you reach out to one of us now, you're going to be able to get in touch with all of us, and we can help you address a lot of these issues very quickly, not just questions of access. And since I'm on that topic, we're not meeting in July because of the 4th of July, but every month we have, on the first Thursday of every month, we have an online office hours. If you have questions about my presentation today that don't occur to you right now, please join us. We're happy to take, you can have a question even if you don't have a question. We love to have people just join us and hang out and learn from us. We always learn something from every time we get together for one of these office hours. And it's become a great way for me to address some of the topics that I've talked about today, but also to learn about new collections and, address people's questions about both the DPLA and other issues as well. So please join us. We would love to have you and hope to see you soon at one of those. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Let me very quickly kind of talk about the DPLA right now, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Biz. The DPLA has been around for 10 years. And if you're familiar with grant agencies at all, you know that they tend to be really focused on the brand new, shiny new project. Supporting an ongoing project is not usually what they tend to do. And so the DPLA as a nonprofit, a standing alone independent nonprofit, is getting to the point where they realize that this aggregation project they've been doing for 10 years with 50 million records really needs more of an institutional home. And so a lot of the talk about the DPLA in the last few months has really been them trying to find their way toward a process in order to find a home for the aggregation project that will give it an institutional structure and really support it in a way that they'll be able to add more staff, take on more initiatives, and really sustain it over a long period of time. The model that I've been using for this is HathiTrust, which, if you're at all familiar with it, is a project that lives at the University of Michigan Library, but is actually separate. It has its own governance, has its own technical staff, can set its own priorities. And what the DPLA is reaching for is something similar to that. So rather than being a standalone nonprofit, the aggregation project of these 50 million records would have a more of an institutionalized home, and that way be in a more sustainable position for the long term. The goal that they've set for themselves is to identify that new home next month in July. Um, Biz and I have talked about this a lot. We don't know if they're necessarily going to hit that deadline. I wouldn't be surprised if that slips a little bit. But the last I've heard, they had 5 credible offers. And so we will see what happens. But I am optimistic about the prospect of being able to find a new home for this, and that will allow us to continue to work with them in the future. So I may not be talking about the DPLA as such. I may be talking about this cultural aggregation project, which has a new home. But one way or another, it's still going to allow us to share your records with a nationwide project. Um, and I think that is pretty much it.
Great, thank you, Rick. We have some questions in the Q&A actually. So I'll go ahead and I'll read those. Kay asks, how do changes in metadata take place? Is it a direct link? So if I change it on my end, it changes on yours, or would you need to be informed so that you can make the change?
Uh, Let me talk about that in a couple different ways. So what we're doing is when the metadata specialist at the university is working with your liaison, they're actually making a copy of your metadata as is and then translating that, mapping it over to our mods profile. So yeah, let's say that we do that in April of 2024. So we're working with your metadata as it is right there, and we have those direct links. So we're going to be able to point directly at your record regardless. But the metadata that you're sharing with us will be in a mods form when we share it on Michigan Memories or the DPLA. Now, so your metadata is not actually changing. We're just copying it over and adapting it to the different metadata schema. Now, here's the thing. We have an arrangement with the DPLA that we do this 4 times a year. So every January, April, July, and October, they take a look at everything that we have, and then they ingest it into their systems and do an update. What this means is you have a lot of flexibility in working with us because you don't have to have everything perfect up front, and it doesn't have to be set in stone. So, for example, if you said, well, we're not really sure how this is going to work, so we'd like to start with just one record, one collection, and just go with that and see how it goes. That's perfectly fine. You can start with that one collection. We can adapt that, get it working, get it up on DPLA Michigan Memories. And then if you look at that and say, okay, I feel pretty good about that, let's add some other collections. We could just add those into the next harvest, the next quarterly harvest. In addition to that, if you make improvements to your metadata, if you remediate it for DI purposes, or you expand the granularity of your metadata, you add more metadata fields, that's perfectly fine too, because we can just simply do an update of the metadata we use to describe your records, and then we can send those updates onto DPLA. So your metadata isn't changing on our end, but if you want to make changes to it, we can simply include those in updates and make sure that we keep everything up to date for you. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Rick. I'll add on 2 things to that. The first thing, Kay says, yes, thank you. One is that with the new Michigan memories, so that's the DPLA, but with the new Michigan memories, those sorts of metadata harvest could be done on demand
Mhm. Yeah, and then we'll automatically update it every 30 days too.
every 30
So,
days.
we're not telling the DPLA this, but actually Michigan Memories will be more up to date than DPLA for most of the year. So
Mhm. There's part of that. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is that if your metadata, if you have digital collections or you're creating digital collections, but the metadata required fields aren't where they need to be harvested by the Michigan Service Hub. The Library of Michigan does have an Improving Access Information Grant, which is IMLS funding through the LSTA granting program. And you can use those grant funds to improve or remediate metadata for inclusion in the DPLA and the Michigan Service Hub. So metadata, as we all know, is very time consuming, can be very expensive work, but there are available options out there to help fund and support that work. I just want to make sure people were aware of that. So I can drop that in the chat. All
yeah,
right, we've got
and
some.
as I said, we really like to be an excuse. So if you're
Yeah.
sharing with us and you can go to your director and say, look, we're sharing these collections, we're getting a lot of use and a lot of visibility from it. It would be really great if we could get a grant to improve our metadata or just put the resources into it. You know, I'm happy to even talk on your behalf if you want that done. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm hoping it will. I'd love to be an excuse.
We have another question. Christopher asks regarding thumbnail images. Is there a resolution or a typical size or dimension that you're looking for?
Um, it varies. That would be part of the conversation you're going to have with the metadata specialist. If you do a search on DPLA, you can see there are different ranges and different scopes. Um, yeah, I don't have a specific pixel dimension in mind. I don't think we've really been quite that limited. So there's a little bit amount of flexibility in it. Um, yeah, and the DPLA has never really specified things to that degree. Uh, but that's actually an interesting question. I'm actually going to get into it, see if I can dig into that a little bit. It's not been an issue up to now, but we can certainly. I'll come to an office hour. I'll have a better answer for you.
See, like we said, we're always learning things, and there's always a question that somebody hasn't asked yet.
It's true.
And then we have another question, and this comes from Heidi. She asks, is there another or any way to know other than guessing from web traffic or user feedback if our materials have been included in the exhibits and curriculum on DPLA? What about the new Michigan memory site? And how are Michigan curriculum/exhibit topics going to be put together?
Okay, that's a really good question, and some of that is still a work in progress, but because the new site is not up and running yet, the DPLA, if they're going to use your materials, and especially at this point now where they're in the process of this transition, they're not going to be making exhibits for quite a while yet. I think it's going to have to be in a new home before they start using uh, materials and exhibits going forward. For as far as Michigan Memories goes, you'll know about it because I will contact you and ask your permission. Uh, and so that will be the first way to answer that. We want to make sure that, we get your input on it and get your permission from it. So we will let you know about that. We do have some materials that we will be putting up early on. Most of those come from institutions that have already been a part of the sort of inner circle. But going forward, yeah, we'll be asking permission. I think I missed a part of the question in there somewhere. Um,
Sorry, one second. Let me make sure. Oh, and how are the Michigan curriculum and exhibit topics being put together?
I have a content team that I put together, put a content team together right before lockdown. But fortunately everybody was able to meet online, so we were able to keep going. They include an archivist, an education expert, a couple of education experts. Um, and at the same time, I'm open to actually adding more people and having more people join that effort. It's been a 4-person team for a while, but I'd like to add some more voices to it. So I am open to people joining us or talking to us. If you have any suggestions, please feel free to get in touch with me. It's the challenge here is that there are so many different things we could cover with something about Michigan Memories that and we don't really have any say over the exhibits that are being created on DPLA. I'm talking specifically about Michigan Memories here. But it's one of those cases where there's so many different things we can talk about. We have to kind of limit ourselves just to sort of figure out, what to start with. Um, so we're going to be looking at commemorative months. In fact, well, things like say commemorations of Black History Month, Women's History Month, um, Arab American Heritage Month. We're really trying to cover a lot of the commemorative months as an example. We're looking at topics like summers in Michigan, that sort of thing, sort of broad topics. But in terms of curricular materials, we've had some focus group meetings with Michigan teachers trying to get their recommendations about what kinds of topics they would be looking for, and in particular, how to frame the lesson plans in a way that would be of maximum value to you. So I'm trying to reach out as much as I can to people to try to get as many different voices as I can into the process. But to a certain degree, uh, we're going to just sort of have to kind of experiment a little bit in terms of what topics we cover, and then just sort of build on things over time. The added piece of this is that in the last few months, the service hub coordinators like me at the other Great Lakes hubs, we started to meet every month. And so the exhibits that we make, I think are going to, through collaboration with some of these other service hubs, may be Great Lakes focused, not just necessarily Michigan focused. So that may make us more useful for people who are researching a topic because we can point to resources in other states as well. So sorry, it's a bit of a rambling answer to you, but it is sort of a process that we're kind of working out organically and trying to figure out. And I want to try to make sure that as many voices can be a part of that as they possibly can. Probably the easiest way to be a part of that discussion is, again, the office hours, because I can give you updates on where we are in terms of building up content as we keep going.
Great, thanks, Rick.
Mhm.
Yeah, and if you have suggestions for things, like if you're like, I have collections about this, something that has come up a lot is airports that no longer exist in Michigan. Like we've been talking to a bunch of different cultural memory organizations that have a lot of collections around that. And we're just like, wow, there's a lot of these around Michigan. Maybe this is something we should look at. So it just kind of comes up organically a lot.
Mhm.
We have another question from Christopher. He asked, if an institution creates educational materials like a webinar, podcast, lecture for sharing via YouTube, is Michigan Memories attempting to add them to the database for the benefit of educators?
We might add them to the database, but the other thing we could potentially do is add them to a page of content on the site and point to it from there. So we have a couple different options. And again, this gets into the point that we're not limited in terms of file format. If you can host it, we can point at it. And so probably what I do in that case is talk to you about, what that particular curricular tool actually is, and then we could find a good home for it on the site.
Thanks. I don't know if there were any other questions. None have come in. If you think of them, we'll be around. But Rick, would you mind going ahead just, I think probably 2 slides. So wanted to
Oh, yes. Yeah.
share some last minute details.
Yeah.
One more.
We did that.
Yeah. Um, so this has been great. And like
Before
I
you do
said,
that, before you do that, let me just do, I
yeah,
don't want to lose sight of Heidi, and we had some people who are talking about their collections in chat, and I want to make sure to
yeah,
highlight those.
sure.
So we have from Heidi, Catala has 2 large postcard collections, a large general photograph collection, a few automotive related collections are all online among many other smaller ones. We're hoping to digitize our real estate collection and get that online too. Yeah, LOM grant. Uh, and that one really be a defining digital collection for us and for our most popular services. We've been part of the DPLA Michigan Memories for a while. They certainly have. And then from Julie, cemetery records, five owned by the township, as well as obit information for each of those graves. That's great. Is what we're envisioning for Waterford. Yes. Obits for residents who passed and buried elsewhere. Waterford Township Public Library. Excellent. And then Mary from Monroe County Library System uses the BiblioBoard platform and has been uploading many collections to reflect the local history treasures housed at our 16 branches. It is rich in photos and also some vintage postcard collections. Nice. Documents and articles. Yeah, this is great. These are exactly the kinds of collections we're looking for. If you've been able to digitize them, we can talk now. If you haven't, please talk to Biz and we can talk later. But it's exactly collections like this that are going to add to the richness of the collections that we're sharing in Michigan Memories. So thank you for posting those.
Great, thanks. Yep. I'm always excited to hear about digital collections that are around and out there, or even just local history collections that haven't been digitized yet and are soon to be available online. So I did just want to invite you all to the last webinar in this How to Pick series. It's going to be how to pick your program, hosting a community scanning day. So that will be August 27th at 1 p.m. I dropped the registration link in the chat, so feel free to register to that if you have any hope of inviting your community in to build and expand your own digital collections, or just reach out and build those connections with the community and help your patrons learn how to digitize their own materials. And then the very last thing, Rick, if you wouldn't mind, just going to the next slide, is a big hearty thank you to Rick for presenting and sharing this wonderful information. Big thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this webinar series possible. Here's our contact information. You can reach out to us at any time. And I've also just dropped a link in the chat for evaluation on the webinar series. So feel free to fill that out. It's really short and it helps us improve our programming here at the library. If there are topics that you would like covered that we haven't talked about this round, please feel free to include that or reach out to us directly so that we can continue to create programming and services to help support you. And then the person from Paw Paw Library asked about, can you send the link for the Improving Access Information Grant? Yep, I'm going to drop in the short link. And that is the quickest way to get there. So it's michigan.gov/LSTA, and it's the Improving Access to Information Grant. The cycle for that just closed at the end of May, but it is usually offered annually. A little bit more information. It's a $5,000 to $25,000 bucket. And one of the requirements, if you get one of the digitization focus grants, because there's different tracks, is that you share your collections with the DPLA. So we really try to support these programs and services at a statewide level. If you have collections, but you aren't able to share them online, like you don't have the ability to host them, like you'd like to share them, you'd like to have them harvested by the DPLA, the Library of Michigan does have free digital collections hosting through our ContentID instance, and I'm happy to talk to you about that as well. We host collections from over a dozen partner organizations right now, and we take care of all the metadata harvesting for you for the DPLA. So they harvest the metadata through the Library of Michigan's LM Digital site, but it still is representing that it's your individual institution's collections. So if you don't have the infrastructure or expertise, any of the resources required to host collections online, but you have the content, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk to you about our program.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.